Hello, Clare and John here from JH Coaching. Today we thought that we would come outside, it's nice and sunny, and show you a bit of the area where we live. But also today what we'd like to do is answer some of your endurance training questions. So often when we're coaching people, lots of questions come around again and again and again, so we thought we'd do a few videos to answer some of those questions. So one of the first questions was from someone who is currently starting training after quite a long break, and what she wanted to know was whether you need a strong aerobic base before you start high intensity work.
The short answer is no, you don't, because a lot of people use high intensity training exclusively, and it doesn't really work for endurance sport completely. The issue really is that although you can just do high intensity work straight away, you won't be able to do very much of it, because the base is basically a base to work from. So the trick would be to do some high intensity work, and the majority of your training will have to be low intensity as you build up the volume, and then you can do more and more high intensity work as you build your fitness.
The next question was about an endurance session, which I guess is linked to aerobic base. So what is an endurance session? And also, as well as what is an endurance session, how long should an endurance session be?
Typically endurance training is designed to build your endurance, obviously, but also an endurance training zone, or a lot of training zones, which we're going to get onto later, is typically fairly low intensity. So the idea of training in this endurance zone is to build the efficiency, make you more efficient, your aerobic efficiency, all your heart and lungs and your muscles will get much better at transporting oxygen and working, and that makes everything more efficient. But if you're training for long ultra endurance type events, or you're training to build your ability to do a sportive for the distance that you've not done before, then what you should do is try and build the duration of your endurance rides to be the same, or as close to the same as you can, as you will be using in your actual event. Obviously, if you're doing something like the transcontinental race, then that's not going to happen. So you should build up the day. You should be able to ride for 1 day or 2 days at that sort of duration per day.
Yeah, I think sometimes doing back-to-back days can be good if you're doing a long event, can't it?
It can, once you've... it's not really the area to focus on, because in an ultra endurance event, what you're trying to do is build the ability to ride for a long time without getting more tired. So after the first couple of days you get tired, and then you stay at the same level of tiredness, roughly speaking. Obviously when you get there you're totally knackered, but you can't afford to get more and more tired. So once you know you can ride for your 16 hours a day or whatever you choose to do, then what you're aiming to do is get faster for 16 hours.
Right.
So actually focusing on the 1 day can be a better strategy than trying to do day after day when you're just increasingly getting more tired.
Okay, so another question that we had was around training zones and what training zones are. So what are training zones?
So training zones are really a way of objectively defining the intensity that you're training and subsequently analysing the intensity that you've trained at. And nowadays they tend to be based on your what's known as functional threshold power. You may have heard of that. Functional threshold pace, critical pace, anaerobic threshold, and these are all roughly the same thing, and for practical purposes the same thing. So if you wanted to test, if you did a running test for your critical pace or your critical power running, that you could use that the same as functional threshold power, so don't get too hung up on the terminology. And the functional threshold power is the point at which you start to quickly accumulate waste products in your muscles, and if you work above that threshold for any length of time, a few minutes, you'll have to slow down. Whereas below that level, you can usually work for quite a long time, so 35 to 70 minutes. And so the training zones just split up. Some you can use 5 zones. For cycling, we like the Andy Coggan zones, which is just 5 zones, and they work really well. 1, 2 and 3 are below your threshold power or pace, and 4 straddles it, and 5 is above it. So most of your endurance training that we talked about before will be in zone 2 and some of it in zone 1, and you'll still be getting some fitness benefits by just riding easy. And if you really want to thrash yourself, then zone 5 above your functional threshold power, and spending some time in that zone is important because it makes big gains, but if you do too much you'll be too tired. Just to add to that, I think we've probably both had some experience of when we've trained too hard or too high in intensity.
Yeah, well, when you first started coaching me, then the first thing you did is you made me run slower on my morning runs, and once I started running more slowly on my morning runs, I suddenly made a massive gain in terms of my pace overall, because I wasn't too tired to do the rest of my training, my more quality stuff, and I was becoming more efficient, more fit in a lower zone, so I got faster without putting the same amount of effort in, basically. The next one is linked to this, and we might already have answered it really, and that's about how does training in these lower zones, zone 1 and 2, actually make you faster?
Yeah, well, we'd certainly touched on it. Basically, the more you do, the better you'll be to a large extent, as long as you don't get overtired. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, but if you look at what the best athletes do, the best endurance athletes, they spend a lot of time training, and a lot of that time is in low intensity zones. It's remarkable the amount of time that the best athletes in the world spend in lower intensity training, and yet they're able to race at incredibly high intensities for long durations of time. So basically the answer to the question is training in low intensity helps you recover from harder training, and it makes you more efficient, which means that when you do want to go faster, you can go a lot faster.
I think the interesting thing about that, which it seems obvious, but to go back to training zones, they are individual. Your training zones are your training zones of a percentage of your max or your threshold, and that's going to be different. It might be similar to some people, but it is unique to you. And sometimes when you're training in a group, you can think that you're running hard, and for somebody else, if they're a lot fitter, they're only in zone 2, so they might be able to go on for a lot longer.
Yeah, that's right. That's certainly true with a lot of the people I've trained with.
Yeah. So it's nice to train in groups, but sometimes it's difficult to keep it to your pace and what you want.
If you want to train in a group and you're training with somebody a lot fitter, then you just make that, think about it and plan that to be one of your harder sessions. It's one of their easier sessions. It's one of your
why not
harder
make it
sessions.
a tempo run for you, and make sure that you add that into your training. So the next question was about something called RPE, which it stands for Relative Perceived Exertion. So what is relative perceived exertion, and how does that work?
This relative perceived exertion is just how hard you're working, and I'll just wait for this motorbike to come past. Somebody else is enjoying the Col de Mantet, same as us. It's much easier on a motorised vehicle than it is on a bicycle, as we can both testify.
Yes.
So perceived exertion is how hard you feel that you're working, and there is a scale. We work with a 10-point scale, which is what's embedded in Training Peaks, and actually it's a really effective method of training, and obviously in the olden days, not that olden days when I started running, and to some extent when I moved into cycling, that's all we had. We gradually started introducing heart rate monitors, but perceived exertion was what we worked with, and so when we did interval sessions, we did them as hard as we could to get through the session at the same pace, and we learned that our endurance pace runs were at a conversational pace. So if you're out cycling or running with somebody and you can have a conversation, then that's your endurance pace. If you start breathing hard and you have to use single words and you find it difficult to talk, then you're probably going too hard for an endurance session. If you can talk and you're supposed to be doing an interval session, you're not going hard enough. So there are these rules of thumb. When we set training plans, we usually say this should feel like you shouldn't be able to talk during this session, or you should be able to have a conversation during this session. So that's all it is, and it's really effective.
And how accurate is it?
Well, I can quote an example. The Brownlee brothers, you may have heard of them, the best triathletes in the world, and Alistair Brownlee won the Olympics, and Johnny was third in London, I think, and they're both basically at the pinnacle of the sport. And I'm quite close friends with their coach, Jack Maitland, or I was when I used to run felt in the mountains. We're not in touch so much now. He told me that they didn't like the gadgets as a rubber band. So even though they were sponsored by Garmin, they weren't collecting data, or they weren't using the data. The coaches were using the data, but they were training to RPE. So it works really well. And if you look at runners in the past, the runners in the 60s and 70s, they were running not much different to the best nowadays. Certainly if you look at the UK performances, I used to do a lot of running with John Graham, who ran 2:09. 2:09 is still a pretty good time for a British athlete.
For a marathon?
For a marathon, yes.
So RPE can work really well. You don't need a gadget to be able to think, right, I'm going to do a recovery run today, or a recovery ride, I'm going to do something a bit faster today.
No. I mean, the good thing about the gadgets is that they probably stop you doing things too hard. That's often the case. It's very tempting to think you're not working hard enough.
Yeah, I think that's always been my difficulty. I always think I'm going too slow. In relation to this relative perceived exertion, a question that I had just this week actually was about somebody who had done a run, and they were training to heart rates. Their relative perceived exertion stayed the same, but their heart rate went up. So what they wanted to know, or what she wanted to know, was should she stay with the relative perceived exertion, or should she slow down to match the heart rate zone?
Generally, you should stick with the heart rate zones, because that is giving you, unless it's excessively hot and you're sweating a lot and you become dehydrated, in which case your heart rate can be unreliable, or you're starting dehydrated, then it is best to stick with the heart rate zones and see how that goes. There are a few reasons that she might have felt that she wasn't working any harder, but her heart rate was going up, and it could well be that she's a little bit overtrained, a little bit tired, and in that case your heart rate doesn't go up very fast, and so therefore it just might have been very slow to rise, and she was still going at the same pace. The other reason might have been that she was actually running faster, but it didn't seem any faster, and the heart rate was drifting up for that reason. So and that can happen as you go throughout a training ride or run, and if you start feeling good, then you tend to drift up. And quite often actually, if you do a session, I found if you do a session on a turbo trainer, an indoor trainer, it can feel a little bit hard at first, and gradually as you get into it, and it's easier. I mean, that's the point of a warm-up, isn't it?
Yeah. So sometimes what can happen as well, if you're not fit enough to do the full durations, your heart rate goes up as the session progresses, and it's simply because you are actually working harder.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah. That's right.
Okay, those were the questions that we had for this week. We hope they were helpful for you. We hope that you found some answers that were useful for you in your training. If you've got any further questions, do let us know. You can put a comment just below in the YouTube comment section, or get in touch with us at www.endurancebikerun.com. We'll be happy to help, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you've got.
Look forward to hearing from you, and see you in the next video. Bye.
See you later.